lecture, if you will, on philosophy and theory. And today I would like to make the case that you should try reading theory, which to say, in this video, I would like to talk a little bit about what I think are some of the benefits of getting into reading theory, share with you some of my own experience when it comes to reading theory and how I first got into reading theory, talk a little bit about what theory actually is and what types of theory there are, and maybe debunk some of the popular myths or tropes about theory, and see if we can use this as a sort of general introduction into reading theory. But my basic pitch, if you want to call it that, is that reading theory is a way to make everything more interesting. Like for me, when you start reading theory, movies become more interesting, art becomes more interesting, politics becomes less doom and gloom and more interesting because you start being able to understand and analyze ideology. It makes philosophy more interesting, it makes literature more interesting. In fact, I think that like as a simple hack, if you will, for getting interested in things, theory can be a really good lens to apply to the world. And I think that overall, I would make the case that perhaps the best way to not succumb to depression and anxiety and a sense of pervading doom is to remain interested. That as long as we feel like we have a stake in things, like a reason to read things and learn things and discover new things, then we actually feel more alive. And so for me, theory was always a way to be more actively interested in the world. And I like, to be totally honest, I never particularly enjoyed reading books or literature until I started reading theory. In fact, I wasn't even really that much into art or politics or even poetry, cinema until I started reading theory. So I think that theory can be a really good way into enjoying other things and sort of enriching them. That's my sort of general pitch, but I'd like to give you a more step-by-step explanation of how you can start reading theory and what theory actually is. So before I begin, I want to briefly give you a personal story about how I started reading theory. When I was in university, this was, so briefly, I'm not sure if I've shared this before, but I did my bachelor's at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And I did my bachelor's in both history and Portuguese language and culture. Now, I actually flunked out of history after my first semester because at the time, so many people were studying history that they had to kick people off the course. And one of the ways in which they did that was that they had these immensely difficult exams that were full of like historical facts and like a lot of memorization. And it turns out that I hated that. I hated the idea that history was a kind of just applied expertise or niche that you had to develop. Already then, I should have known that I had, if you will, a more theoretical way of approaching things, which at the time wasn't very popular in the Netherlands, at least not in my department. And so I flunked out of history after the first semester, and I continued with Portuguese language and culture. And what I liked about Portuguese language and culture was that it had a strong emphasis on post-colonial theory, which is actually how I got into reading other types of theory. But I can explain that later. But my first experience actually reading a piece of theory and enjoying it was when we were assigned the opening chapter of Michel Foucault's The Order of Things. And it's such an unusual opening because he actually starts by having a literary analysis of a text by Borges. Here's a text by Borges I've recently been reading. And if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've read this, Michel Foucault basically analyzes one of Borges' stories about a fictional encyclopedia in which meaning is attributed to categories in a very different way, which to say it's an imaginary taxonomy. Instead of classifying the world in the way which we ordinarily would, it has a completely different way of structuring our reality. And Michel Foucault uses his, if you will, analysis of that Borges story to make an argument about the way in which we apply taxonomy and ideology to our own lives, the order of things. And that was so mind-blowing to me. Like at this point I was like 18, 19 years old, and I read a lot and I learned a lot, but I'd never actually read a piece of theory. I'd never actually looked at the world in this way. It was so incredible to me that you could take a text from Borges, which was essentially idea-driven, and then apply that to, if you will, a philosophical and critical argument about the nature of our own reality. Which is to say, it was the very first time that I read a text that made me feel engaged as a reader. Like I wasn't just passively consuming it or supposed to admire it as one of the best things ever written, etc. But it was actually inviting me as the reader into a critical discourse, not just with Foucault, with Borges, but in a sense with the world. And that was immensely exciting to me. Like I really remember that. But the reason I remember it is twofold. It's because I thought I'd made this major discovery, and the next day I went back into class. This had been our assigned reading, and I was super excited to discuss this text. I was like, wow, this is the first time I've read something that really resonated with me. Like, now I understand why people want to read books. And then I realized that some of my best friends in class, they had not had that experience at all. In fact, they were quite angry. They were really angry with Foucault because they thought it was the worst piece of writing they'd ever read. Like, they thought it was alienating, that it was jargon-laden, that it was abstract, that it didn't make a point. All of the sort of common accusations that you've probably encountered when it comes to French philosophical post-war writing. And that was immensely puzzling to me because it was the first time that I realized that what I experienced from reading a theory text, which spoke to me very much, wasn't necessarily true for everybody else. Now, this isn't to suggest that I had some like heightened intelligence or enlightened understanding. I think it was simply because I experienced a moment, like a little epiphany, where it felt like this text came to me as an arcane puzzle. Like there was so much that I didn't understand, but it meant that there was so much more that I wanted to learn. And like that's the thing I think about reading theory, but also philosophy, which is that it's essentially a world building exercise. Like one of the slightly boring things about reading books that are just part of the mainstream press is that they're products, essentially. Like they've been perfectly edited so that you can consume them as a reader, that you can read them and get the main ideas and move on with your life. But a theory text doesn't really do that. Like a piece of theory actually is going to raise a lot of questions, introduce a lot of ideas and concepts that it essentially assumes you already understand partially, or what I believe to be true, it challenges you. It challenges you to go out and do more reading. Like one of the fun things for me is that like there's a world building element to reading theory where there's always something else that you feel like you want to read. And as you read over the years, you piece together the knowledge and then it kind of expands. And I think this is actually where one of the negative stereotypes comes from when it comes to like the theory bro, which is that everybody has this negative stereotype, understandably, of the theory bro, the insufferable person who just wants to mansplain all these concepts to you, who treats you like an inferior person for not understanding jargon-laden concepts, etc. But I think part of it is that maybe, and this is just my theory, maybe we haven't really built a community around theory where we can share the excitement of discovering theory and how it relates. Like fundamentally, like my personal journey when it comes to reading and studying theory is very nerdy. Like it's a geek thing. In the same way that we used to love talking about like Pokemon or Magic the Gathering or the lore of Warhammer 40K, like stuff that really required an intense, almost obsessive fixation with one thing. In the same way, I was able to take that energy and apply it to theory. Because once you start studying theory, it makes you realize that there is so much lore. Like, there's literally so much that you need to know. And then you start going on side quests. Like, then you might start reading some Kierkegaard or some existentialism, or you go on another side quest into, I don't know, reading any form of theory, literary theory, film theory, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, critical race theory, which of course has become very polemical, cultural studies, critical terrorism studies, critical legal studies. It's this enormous body of work that shares certain themes and considerations, but ultimately you get to choose your own adventure. And to my mind, it was like the first time that I read something that really made me feel like actively engaged. Like you could spend your whole life reading more of it, and then it opens new avenues and new thoughts. In fact, I'll challenge you to this. If you start reading theory and then you go watch a movie or read a book or go to an art gallery or even just go to the supermarket and engage in day-to-day activities, you will find that your brain starts making connections in relationship to the theory that you've read. Like that's the power of theory, is that it kind of sparks all of these new connections in the world, which is a super, to my mind, addictive way of being in reality because it makes you so much less passive and so much more actively engaged. Okay, so now that I've explained that a little bit, my own journey into theory, which ironically started with Michel Foucault, and I'm not really into Foucault that much anymore. Like, I spent a lot of time reading everything that he'd written in all of his lectures until I got to the point where I thought, well, I'm not sure I actually agree with this, which is also one of the beauties of reading theory, right? You're not reading it for a master who tells you what to think. You're reading it because you're trying to figure out what you think. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about what theory actually is. And I want to start a little bit askew, which is to say I want to show you Terry Eagleton's literary theory, which is a book that makes an argument about what literary theory is, but actually also in so doing makes a lot of arguments about theory as such. In fact, this book was based on a seminar that he taught at, I believe it was Warwick, at the University of Oxford, which at the time was like a really revolutionary thing to do, to sort of go against the strictly old school interpretation of analyzing English literature to introduce the suspiciously French and continental idea of a literary theory. And his basic argument is very simple. He says we can't make a distinction between literature on the one hand and ideology on the other, because literature is an ideology. And that, to my mind, is actually one of the basic starting points that you have to understand for theory. It argues that the world is essentially a text that we can learn to read. In fact, that the world is something, reality is something that is subject to interpretation. And of course, in so doing, subject to a critical interpretation. What are the ideologies, the power structures, if you will, the mechanisms that structure our reality? In fact, how do things appear to us as natural or common sense? And who does it benefit for us to view the world in those ways? This is also why theory is sometimes referred to as a hermeneutics of suspicion, which is to say it casts an inherently suspicious glance at the world and how it is presented to us. Slavoj Žižek's definition of philosophy, by the way, is heavily influenced by theory. He says, philosophy begins as soon as we refuse to accept what exists as given. That's essentially the impulse of all theory, that you look at the world around you and that you apply a critical interpretive lens, i.e., in some way, that you treat the world not as a given, but as an ideological product, if you will. But that's very broad still. So let me give you some of the historical, if you will, avenues into theory. So for a very long time, we don't even talk about theory. Instead, it's philosophy. System building is the main idea within philosophy. You need to have a Gesamtphilosophie that is usually related to some Grundeinsicht, which is to say you need to have a total philosophy, a system that explains everything, that is related to one key or core insight. And sort of the beginning of this, the systematizing drive within philosophy, is something that Plato does on the one hand, or to be precise, Plato does it through the Socratic dialogue, and then we have Aristotle on the other side. Both of them have totalizing visions of the world in very different ways. We have Platonic idealism that renders the world essentially secondary to the essence of the ideal, some super phenomenological entity that cannot or perhaps can be known. And then we have Aristotle, who kind of inverts this to simplify and focuses on the world as we know it. What can be examined, what can be studied, what can be reasonably deducted. And in this distinction between Plato and Aristotle, of course, Aristotelianism comes from within Platonic thought in some ways. It is born out from its contradictions, to put it in somewhat Marxist terms. In this division, this binary, if you will, between Plato and Aristotle, we have the beginnings of two completely different worldviews. One of them is an idealism, the other one is a sort of early scientism, which is also another way of saying that one of them is a perceived objectivism, namely idealism as an objective system of all human being, an ontology, if you will, versus a subjective system, which is Aristotelian thought that focuses on categories of thought and reason. In fact, where Aristotle becomes somewhat idealist himself is in the notion of thought thinking itself, a pseudo-mystical conception of how that essentially reconciles the problem of ontology with teleology. Ontology being the nature of being, that which exists in reality. Teleology being the purpose, namely why it exists, what it is for. And the Aristotelian principle was that if you can find out what something serves, i.e. what it is for, then you also know what it is. He essentially makes teleology an ontological category or principle. But those are already like abstract terms, so you don't need to fully understand them quite yet. But in these two camps, essentially, we have the beginning of a philosophical project, which is how can we think of reality in a way that includes everything? Nothing is exempt from it. They're essentially totalizing worldviews. And this idea of philosophy as a kind of Gesamtphilosophie continues throughout the entire history of philosophy. Like Kant, in his critique of pure reason, is already pulling at the seams. He's undermining the possibility of truly objective knowledge of reality, namely to truly know essence, or what he famously calls das Ding an sich, the thing in itself. But he nevertheless upholds the idea that it is possible. Well, not really possible, i.e. we can't do it, but the fact that we can't do it means that it is there. What I like to call the Kantian cop-out, which is to say, reason is subjective reason is a barrier towards the essence or ideal of the ontologically pure object, and yet it is precisely because of this barrier that it nevertheless exists behind it. Anyway, Hegel, huge leap to Hegel. Hegel is the ultimate systematizer, the ultimate world builder. And yet, the paradox, if you will, a paradox which we often refer to as the dialectic, a word that Hegel himself didn't necessarily use all that often, is that Hegel's philosophy, his system of philosophy, his logic, is also, if you will, it's hard to find the appropriate word for it, an anti-system. A system which includes not only everything, but also that which cannot be included within it. Which is to say, Hegel's basic insight, to simplify it to the extreme, is that if a philosophical system wants to be truly absolute, it must also include everything which cannot be included in it. Like, if you think about it, this was the Kantian problem. How can we include subjective reason in ontological purity if subjective reason is already a barrier to it? Hegel kind of takes this problem and says that it is actually the solution. A truly complete philosophical system must include everything that is by definition excluded, determinate negation being one word for this. And so Hegel accomplishes a kind of a paradox, which on the one hand, he like wraps up the entire philosophical edifice and puts a bow on top, which is part of why he says, you know, this is the end of philosophy, I've completed it, philosophy is done, essentially, the end of history. He wraps it up. But at the same time, his wrapping it up also blows it open. Hegel blows open philosophical opportunity, and it scatters in every possible direction. And Marx picks up one of these pieces. And Marxist theory, which is therefore both a scientism, i.e. a supposedly objective theory about the nature of the unfolding of history, seen through a lens of political economy, is therefore the emergence of a, if you will, post-philosophical or even anti-philosophical theory, which is to say, theory is the continuation of philosophy by other means. To continue in a totalizing philosophy after Hegel seems impossible, at least if you properly understand the consequences of Hegelian thought. Hence why after the Hegelian implosion, which is also an explosion, philosophy is now both fractured and yet open. And here, this is also a, if you will, historical phenomenon, which to say that the anti-philosophical movements, which are therefore in a sense Hegelian, go in all kinds of new directions that are overdetermined, or if you will, influenced by the innovations, both technological and ethical and moral and of consciousness, of the 18th and 19th centuries. And so we have the emergence of psychoanalysis as a theory. The Freudian theory of the unconscious is a theory that is only made possible because of this Hegelian implosion. We have the Marxist theory of political economy and world revolution, if you will. And these become hugely influential, but of course, they're not necessarily engaged in philosophy. They're both anti-philosophical. Freud isn't into philosophy. Marx is against philosophy and against religion to some extent. The famous line from Marx is that philosophers have only thought about, the world, but the point is to change it, etc. Now, I'm not going to explain here the influence of materialism or the discovery of the unconscious. I've done that in other lectures, and we can do that again in the future. But I want to make a leap here to what you might call post-war theory. Because what most people encounter as theory, like on the internet or in school, is usually either critical theory, namely theory that is related to the so-called Frankfurt School. And it might be that you've seen critical theory from Adorno, for example, or Horkheimer, but it could also have been Walter Benjamin. I think Walter Benjamin can be an avenue into theory for people. So we have critical theory on the one hand, which essentially, to very briefly give you a simplified introduction, critical theory emerges against the backdrop of a growing disillusion with orthodox Marxism, and specifically with the political application, or misapplication, if you will, of Marxism in the Soviet Union. And this kind of goes in two directions. On the one hand, we have like Sartrean existentialism, which doesn't really engage with Marxism, but simply goes in a completely different direction, and argues that, the central ethical category is that the subject, after the death of God, must choose his own existence and will his own fate. That's one direction. Another direction is phenomenology, which essentially becomes a version of structuralist linguistics, which is to read the world as a text, but also to look at the way in which reality is structured like a language. Again, that would be deserving of a whole nother lecture. Structuralism also then goes into Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is in many ways a structuralist reworking of the principles of Freudian psychoanalysis. Critical theory, which emerges as a school of sorts dedicated to the critical reworking or understanding of power relations in post-war Europe and the United States, seen through a not Marxist lens, but if you will, post-Marxist lens, which is to say it's not simply the application of Marxist concept and theory to reality, but rather the identification of ideological currents within supposedly non-fascist life. This is also why Adorno's Minima Moralia, which is essentially short reflections and aphoristic stances on contemporary life, he has the subtitle Reflections on Damaged Life. As a critical theory emerges as a body of thought that essentially is engaged in the idea of a critique of ideology that could go beyond orthodox Marxism. There's a lot more to discuss here, especially about the ways in which the Frankfurt School then was able to work in the United States as exiles during World War II and afterwards, but that's for another video. Now, critical theory is still very much its own Germanic movement, if you will. And French theory goes in a very different direction, as I've already indicated. So French post-war thought develops in terms of existentialism, which I wouldn't even really call theory, but we could sort of include here as a symptomatic response to the shortcomings of Marxism or orthodox Marxism. Then we have phenomenology. Then we have Lacanian psychoanalysis. And through this emerges what you may have heard of before, deconstructionism. And deconstructionism blows open theory and post-war thought, which is to say, it's another revolution within a revolution. And deconstructionism is often thrown around as this incredibly abstract term that can be applied to anything. But the very basic, if you will, formula for deconstructionism is to go back to, is derived from Derrida and Derrida's use of binary categories. However, it's very important to note, before people get mad, that Derrida didn't think of himself as a deconstructionist, that he also did not in any way advocate for a simple formula that could be applied. And here's one of the caveats when it comes to theory. Theory also became part of what you might call the professionalization of philosophy and post-war theory within the academy, within the university system, which is to say people started specializing in specific types of thought and then taking it as if it were this doctrine that could be applied to things. So you take Derrida's writing, you call it deconstructionism, you turn it into this trope of binary opposites that can be read against each other, and then you start applying it to everything. You apply it to film and to books and to blah. And before you know it, you've created this very, if you will, narrow-minded community of people who have to defend their own way of looking at the world because it's become part of their professional identity and it's tied to their own power within the university system. Of course, this can continue ad nauseum. You could do a deconstruction of the neoliberal university, etc., right? In fact, when I was in university, cultural studies had become a dominant force. And cultural studies was sort of this relatively abstract term for a school of thought that increasingly was taking some critical theories, some deconstructionism, and applying it to various other forms of pop culture. So anything could be analyzed, which is quite exciting, but also had its limitations. Now, what I haven't covered here, it's a lot to fit in, and sorry if I'm not being very concise. What I haven't covered here is that deconstructionism also leads to an explosion of thought as to what theory can actually be. Because if you can read the world like a text, if you can critique the ideology of what exists as given, if you've moved beyond orthodox Marxism, then suddenly you can have all these different specializations. And this is where we start seeing, in the 1960s especially, but also in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early aughts, the development of feminist theory, the development of race theory, the development of post-colonial theory, the development of literary theory, the development of film theory, the development of art theory, the development then of terrorism theory and legal theory. And this explosion meant that suddenly philosophy not only had left the philosophy departments, nor had it simply moved into the small schools of Frankfurt School critical theory, but suddenly it went everywhere. Its tentacles were going into every department. Every department started having a theory program. And this is where you start seeing some of the right-wing backlash. The idea of quote-unquote cultural Marxism, they've infiltrated our universities, etc., can be traced back specifically to the expansion of post-war critical thought and the critique of ideology that therefore find its way into almost every discipline. Because, of course, as soon as you start critiquing ideology and power structures, well, one of them is the university system and the way in which knowledge is accumulated and delivered to us. Now, this is not to defend it nor to attack it, but we reach peak theory, if you will, at around the mid-2000s, 2010s, in which there's a theory program for everything, and it's becoming a little bit watered down, not always, but sometimes, and certain buzzwords get thrown around. Like, suddenly everyone wants to do a discursive analysis of X. In fact, so much so that we almost go full circle, that some of the terms come up in situations where they mean something completely different. Like if you're in a comparative politics seminar and someone talks about discourse analysis, they may not even mean Foucauldian discourse, namely the power structures and mechanisms that structure the way in which we articulate ideas and thought categories, and therein how we think of ourselves. No, it's specifically the discursive patterns of parliamentary speech, etc. And so theory buzzwords start finding their way into other disciplines and are actually almost neutered into something that is no longer theoretical. Peak theory. And if you want to go to specific conferences or get a paper published, etc., you need to use certain buzzwords that indicate a certain theoretical alignment, because the people on the panels all are in one camp or another, and they will pick up on your little signals that you're sending to them that will then make them be aligned with you. And so theory becomes this weirdly territorial thing, which I think is actually sort of antithetical to what theory should be. Now that I've given you this, and thank you if you're still here, how can you get into theory? And what does that even mean? So, for me, getting into theory in a way that felt productive actually came through reading the work of Slavoj Žižek. Because one of the interesting things that Žižek does that he doesn't really get enough credit for, I think, is that he took theory, but he also kind of plugged it back into an old school, if you will, metaphysical philosophical system. Which is to say, Žižek's Hegelianism, fused with his Lacanianism, is a way of being both a theorist, namely, he applies Lacanian psychoanalysis to film and politics and other types of cultural analysis. But at the same time, it serves the project of going back to Hegel, and through Hegel, examining Marx differently. Which to say, Žižek actually accomplishes something quite fruitful, although we could debate the extent to which he actually accomplishes it. Which is to say, what if theory isn't simply the application of this ever-expanding post-Marxist discourse to reality? What if we can actually go back to the most important ontological philosophical questions? I.e., what if we go back to this moment of the Hegelian explosion using theory, but without simply applying theory? And I think this is actually super important. Like, Žižek doesn't apply concepts to X. He uses X, like films, etc., to then draw out new consequences from within the theory and within the philosophy, which is an inversion of sorts. And here you can see another thinker who kind of accomplishes this, which is Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou is very different from Žižek, but he's also a systematizer, a world builder, an old school philosopher, if you will. And so I think that, to me, where philosophy became interesting again was when I started seeing how theory could be reconciled with the age-old philosophical problems. Because now your reading can go in two directions. You can start reading more theory, and more political theory and cultural theory and the stuff that feels very relevant to our day-to-day existence. But then you can go also backwards, and you can start reading philosophy step by step. You can start reading Hegel, and then you can start reading some Kant and Fichte and Schelling, and you could work your way all the way back. And even those philosophers who don't really fit into the tradition of that problematic, like Schopenhauer or Kierkegaard, or even Nietzsche, are nevertheless very interesting because you can see them through that lens. And now your reading bifurcates. You start reading in a theoretical direction, and you start reading in a philosophical direction. And that's when new ideas start coming, I think. And so in that way, you can reconcile a philosophical interest, because if you just read philosophy texts by themselves, they can be very dry. And you can reconcile what I think is one of the problems with theoretical texts, which is that it's just about throwing around theory and applying it to everything. Like you'll see at certain art galleries where they just love to sprinkle a bit of theories over their texts. you can reconcile those two, and you can go back to what feels like a really engaged attitude towards both philosophical and theoretical problems. And that's Hegel's whole point. Like, Hegel's basic point is that you are lucky to be alive because the problems of our current reality can only be analyzed and thought by you. Like, it's kind of obvious. Hegel could only think what was happening in his time. He couldn't anticipate what was going to happen now. And so suddenly you realize that by reading and applying thought to the world around you, you are actually living the richest possible life. That being alive now is an opportunity to think things and to make connections that other people, even the brightest people, couldn't have done because they weren't alive. And to my mind, there's something very exciting about that, because when you feel interested in the world, it means you're not despairing. It means you're not feeling passive and impotent. It means that you actually have a lens, a framework to want to engage with the world. And that's why my final pitch would be to say that theory can be a community building exercise, that reading theory and using it as a gateway into philosophy can be a way of connecting with other people, like other people who share the same interest. Because if you're into theory and you talk to someone who isn't into theory, it can be a little overwhelming. It's like any specialized interest. If I talk about basketball to somebody who loves soccer, they'll be like, yeah, but why? Or if you talk about Pokemon with somebody who's really into something else, they'll be like, why? And so if you get into theory, I would encourage you to read theory with other people, to have a little book group, or once a week to get a beer or a coffee and to discuss it together, to take notes, to write out your own thoughts, or maybe even to follow my lectures or be a part of our learning community on Patreon. Like, at the end of the day, the reason I started this channel was simply because during the pandemic, I wanted to talk to other people about theory, because I was losing my mind, and I felt like if I didn't have an opportunity to engage in theory and philosophy, I would not be able to make it through. And so this has been a long-winded way of saying, I hope that this encourages you to get into theory, to explore some texts. Look at Verso. Verso is a publisher that has lots of theory. Look for something that interests you and just pick it up and allow yourself to be a little bit bewildered. You don't have to understand everything on the first read through. See it as the opening like the opening chapter in a world building exercise. It's like in a video game when you're in a level where you don't have the powers yet to open certain doors, but then you go through the whole game. Like, I think it's like in Zelda, for example, and you acquire new powers, and now you can go back to the original levels and open all these doors. That's what reading theory and philosophy can be like. It's like you're going to acquire more knowledge, and then you can loop back around to the text that you didn't fully understand, and then you start making new connections. And that's so enriching and so thrilling that I really want you to have that opportunity in your life. That would make me very happy if this video encourages you to pick up some theory or some reading, and hopefully to also feel like it does something beneficial for you. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys. I'm going to host a bonus discussion on Discord in about 5 minutes. We're going to talk a little bit more, and I'm going to answer some of your questions. If you'd like to be a part of our learning community and go a little bit deeper in your understanding of philosophy and theory, please do consider becoming a patron. There's a link in my description, or go to www.patreon.com/, I never know what it is, /Julian Philosophy. That's patreon.com/Julian Philosophy. Enjoy your reading, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.